suspect it's probably the first time people have heard of the term. But very simply, it has a great deal to do with humanism. It's a worldview or a philosophy, if you like, about what we should believe in and what we should care about morally. So, if you think about humanism, in a way, sentientism can be seen as an extension or an upgrade to it, if you like. So, as you've said, questions at the end are fine, but if there are things as I'm going through that you want to flag, I've got the chat window open as well, so feel free to chat in the window, because I don't want to go on for too long and leave something that's really important or I haven't made clear. So the presentation I've laid out here is really designed for an audience that it comes from starting from scratch, right? Whereas I think most of the people on this call are very familiar with humanism as a concept already. So a lot of this, as you've said, Audrey, will be very familiar to you and maybe won't feel that new. Although I guess there's always a slightly personal flavour to the way anyone talks about these types of topics. But let me lead you through it and see what you think. So in simple terms, sentientism it's a worldview or philosophy that talks about what we should believe in and what we should care about. There's two sort of central questions of philosophy. And it answers the first question in exactly the same way as secular humanism does. It says we should commit to evidence and reason. So we don't put any store in supernatural or revealed or mystical beliefs. We essentially think they're fabricated or somewhat arbitrary. And we commit to the process of understanding evidence of reality in all its different uncertain forms and using reason to try and understand what that means. That doesn't mean we think we're perfect. It doesn't mean we think we have perfect knowledge. We understand that these processes are, always have their own issues. The knowledge we develop is probabilistic, but we're just always trying to get less wrong by comparing what we believe about against reality itself. So that's entirely consistent with secular humanism and I guess skepticism and free thinking more generally. Where sentientism differs from humanism is that it's explicitly, when it says what should we care about morally, it draws the boundary in a slightly different way. It says, as you might guess from the name, we should have moral consideration for all sentient beings. And in simple terms, sentience is the capacity for subjective experience. So it's the ability to experience suffering or flourishing or well-being, anything good or bad. It could be as simple as physical pain or a basic physical pleasure, or it could be existential angst or love or a sense of richer well-being as well. It's the ability to experience almost anything. And your next question might be, okay, so which beings are sentient? And to answer that, we go back to evidence and reason. We really follow a sort of scientific basis for trying to work out what things are sentient. And in simple terms, it's humans. I don't 100% know that all of you are sentient and conscious, but I'm pretty confident you are. But we apply a similar process to thinking about other types of beings. And in simple terms, the vast majority of non-human animals you might think of are sentient. So, pigs, dogs, cows, reptiles, birds. There's a lot of interesting science going on around invertebrates. There's a bit of a fuzzy boundary. But in essence, simple terms, we're talking about all humans and the vast majority of non-human animals. And I'll get on to some of the weirder possibilities later on as well. So in simple terms, that's what sentientism is. We believe based on evidence and reason, and we have moral consideration. We show compassion for everything that's capable of suffering. So how you might get to that philosophy is, I guess, set out on the right-hand side, or a suggestion, in that some people would say that the one thing we're all most sure of is our own sentient, our own conscious experience. We know we're experiencing things moment by moment. We know we're feeling good things and feeling bad things. So we're pretty sure of that, even if we are all living in some sort of computer simulation. Regardless, we are experiencing things. We then reason based on evidence that other beings are sentient too, certainly other humans, because we have the same architecture and the same kit very largely, but you can extend that beyond humans as well to understand other beings that are sentient. Now, morally, we experience suffering as good and bad, and people will have different preferences, and different beings will have different flavors of what good and bad are. But it seems fair to reason that other beings experience negative and positive experiences of good and bad as well. And given that morality, almost by definition, is about determining what's good and what's bad based on the degree to which they cause suffering or flourishing or life and death, it's almost tautological that it makes sense, if you decide to be moral, that you should want to avoid causing suffering to beings that are capable of suffering. It's almost that simple. So that's a sort of a personal journey of how you might come to think that sentientism is both a sound basis for believing things, and also a sensible place to draw our moral circle. It might be interesting to, and again, just ping things in the chat if there's anything that I'm saying that isn't clear, but you could summarize the whole thing in one sentence. It's evidence, reason, and compassion for sentient beings. That's it. And I think we'll come on to how it contrasts with humanism from a couple of different directions. One is, where did sentientism come from? What's its intellectual and philosophical heritage, if you like? And then I'm also going to draw some comparisons between some of the different isms that populate this space. So, as you can see in this picture, the top half is that first question: what is it we believe in? And of course, there's a whole plethora of different supernatural belief systems and religious belief systems, but in this sphere, what we're really talking about is a naturalistic philosophy. So that's one that is based on evidence, reason, and recognizing that everything that exists is part of the natural world. Everything is energy, matter, including dark energy and matter, and patterns of information within them. There is nothing beyond that. There's no supernatural mystical force or distinct, undetectable essence outside of that. So in a way, that's naturalism. Now, one place that leads many people is to atheism, in that simply just the lack of a belief in a deity as one particular implication of a naturalistic worldview. But as we know, atheism in itself doesn't really say anything about morality, and it doesn't really say anything positive about what you do believe in. It's just an absence of belief in deities. So then you start to move into the second domain, the bottom half of the diagram there, which is, okay, what is it we should care about? I'll start in the central section. So the central section, in a way, that you could say that's what humanism really comes in and does. It says, okay, we've got atheism. We don't believe that there is a deity. We don't put much store behind religious modes of thinking. But what is the basis for our morals? And in simple terms, humanism, and in the modern context, humanism is largely a secular movement, although you will find people who refer to themselves as humanists who still hold religious beliefs as well. But generally, it's a secular movement. It says, we don't acknowledge any supernatural essence. We're evolved beings, and we are deciding on our own morals based on really, in the same way as sentientism, a compassion for our fellow human. So it's deciding to care not just about the humans in my family, or in my village, or in my town, or in my race, or of my sex or gender, or of my tribe. It's saying, at least to a base degree, we have compassion for every single human. It's like a species solidarity, right? So we have a naturalistic set of beliefs, but we also base our morality on a universal compassion for all humanity and all humans. And I'll tune that later on, because certainly in recent years, it's true that some humanist organizations have already looked at extending that moral circle out beyond humans as well. And I want to acknowledge that. On the left-hand side, you'll see a different movement, which really comes out of animal ethics and animal advocacy. And again, this has a very long history, reaching back, as Amarajit, you were saying, it has religious roots, has roots in many different cultures, and secular cultures as well, that saw causing harm to animals as a moral negative as well. So there's a rich and multi-century history to animal ethics, and a key person who really framed what you might see as the seeds of sentientism was Jeremy Bentham, and he had this famous quote where he talks about, it's not whether something can talk or whether something can think, it's about whether something can suffer. And suffering really is the negative side of sentience. So he was one of the earliest people to make that explicit, that it's the capacity to suffer that means we should morally care about them. All suffering matters regardless of the being that is doing the suffering, not just humans. The word sentientism itself was first used by a chap called Richard Ryder, who's actually a British psychologist, but also, to some degree, an animal ethics philosopher. He coined a couple of key terms. He coined the term anti-speciesism, which was really trying to draw an analogy between human forms of negative discrimination and discriminating based on species. So he was making the negative case to say, in the same way as it's not moral to make artificial distinctions between different groups of humans and to treat some of them negatively because of those distinctions, he was also saying it's unfair and not moral to make moral distinctions just based on the different species of beings as well. And the flip side of that, and a more positive framing of it, was sentientism, the idea that you should care about any being that has the capacity to suffer or has the capacity to feel positive, have positive experiences as well, and they should be included in our moral circle. And it was developed by another famous philosopher called Peter Singer, who some of you might have heard of. He wrote Practical Ethics and Animal Liberation and a bunch of different books, founded some NGOs and charity organizations as well in the field of effective altruism. But when they were talking about sentientism and an alternative term, Sentiocentrism, which is even more clunky, their philosophy was always naturalistic. It was explicitly put as an alternative to religious structures of morals, but it wasn't more broadly naturalistic. So they were using evidence, reasoning, and a scientific basis to understand sentience and to accord moral consideration. But sentientism at that point was only deciding what to care about. It wasn't part of a broader worldview about also what to believe. And what myself and a few other people have done in the last couple of years is really to recast that term of sentientism and to link this idea that we should care about everything sentient with this broader humanistic, naturalistic view, which says we use evidence and reason, not just when thinking about what to care about morally, but we use it everywhere, right? So we have this wider scientific-minded critical thinking commitment in every single domain, and we also apply that when deciding what entities to care about morally, and that now is the modern recasting of, if you like, of sentientism, which is why it's evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient animals, if that makes sense. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how you go from what to believe in to who to care about, and the different fields, both in, through humanist thought and through animal ethics, about, how they converge on sentientism. Now, on the right side of the diagram, this is where it gets a little weirder, and this will annoy many of my fellow sentientists because understandably the priority for most sentientists is sentient beings that exist today, right? And there are approximately 8 billion humans, and there are many trillions of sentient non-human animals as well that exist today that we should care about. They absolutely are the priority. But if you're going to be serious about sentience as your characteristic, and you're going to say anything that's capable of experiencing things, suffering or flourishing, I think at least it makes sense to be open-minded that in the future there might be other types of being that could be capable of sentience. So here, some of these ideas come out of the crazy worlds of science fiction, but as many of you know, science fiction can be quite an interesting way of philosophically thinking through things that end up happening rather rapidly. And there are now quite mature fields working on artificial intelligence and robot ethics that are not just thinking about how to develop tools that will solve problems, but they're also thinking about the ethical implications of advanced artificial intelligences. And while most of that thinking focuses on, how can we develop them and maybe even persuade them so that they don't turn all of the human race into paperclips, or we'll end up in like the last frames of the Terminator movie. There's also parts of those movement, and some of those academics are also thinking, hold on, could we get to the point where a sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence actually develops some form of sentience or some form of consciousness itself? And we might need to accord some moral consideration to it. We might actually need to think about the morality the other way. So while that might seem like a bit of intellectual nerdery on the right, it is an implication of focusing consistently on sentience as the characteristic we use to decide what to care about morally, what beings to care about morally. I know we're going to do questions at the end, but I'm sort of aware I'm going through quite a lot. Is it okay to keep going, or any questions at that point? Or you're muted,
yes, I have a question about life forms such as bacteria and germs or fungi. Are they considered sentient as well in this model, or are they not?
So the short answer is no. So sentientism itself is neutral about which types of beings are sentient. So sentientism just says if it's sentient, you have to give it moral consideration, but it doesn't tell you which ones are. When you ask the question, what things are sentient, it says follow the science. Now, the science is always moving and it's developing, but in simple terms, it appears that sentience and consciousness, which is like a broader, richer version, are really a type of very advanced information processing. So to run that sort of information processing, you normally need a quite advanced nervous system and typically a brain. Again, this is based on inference and it's based on evolving science, but so far the scientific consensus is that you'll be glad to hear, yes, humans are sentient, and in the animal kingdom, birds, mammals, reptiles, fish are all sentient. In invertebrates, it's a more mixed picture and an uncertain picture where cephalopods look highly likely to be sentient. Many insects look like they're sentient as well, but some of the very simpler insects, and so if you go down to things like, a sea cucumber is classed as an animal, but has no nervous system or brain whatsoever. So for an organism, whether it's an animal or a plant or certainly a bacteria or something very simple, it physically doesn't have the kit required to do the information processing that is sentience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, many draw the distinction at nociception, which is the most rudimentary nervous sensing. Is that correct?
Okay.
Yeah. So the definition, nociception is again, I'll reach the edges of my technical knowledge fairly quickly, but nociception is, I think, one step down from sentience, in that there are some organizations that can receive a negative stimulus and can react to that negative stimulus in a way that you could describe as pain, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have a subjective experience of that is negative, if that makes sense. So sentience requires that there is a, like you or I are doing at the moment, if I stab my hand with a pen, I'm experiencing that as a negative qualitative experience, and so sentience is almost like one notch up from nociception, but it's not quite at the level of consciousness, partly because in a way you have to be conscious of a stimulus to experience it, so you could say they're pretty much the same, but sometimes people build extra concepts into consciousness, like creativity or forward planning, or whereas sentience is a lower bar, if you like, than full consciousness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And there's a good question there, is this advocating vegetarianism? You've jumped ahead of me, but in short, it is, or even veganism. That'd be an interesting question, interesting conversation to have as we step through this.
I think Corbina was trying to get a question in.
Yes, I had one more question actually about basically, do different beings have different degrees of sentience? Or would you say that they do? So for example, humans having the greatest degree of sentience, and maybe the invertebrate animals having less sentience, and so maybe being worthy of less consideration in some sense.
So there's, so again, sentientism itself is neutral on that, because we've deliberately kept it as super basic, right? It's evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentience. Now, what that allows you to do is, within that, there are some sentientists who say they insist that every sentient being warrants the same moral consideration. So they might say that, you know, yes, a simpler animal might not have the same richness of experience as a human, but who are we to judge that that is of less moral value? So some sentientists do argue for some sort of equality across all sentient beings. I'm not one of them, and I think most sentientists would agree with me that the science indicates that there are different degrees of sentience, different richnesses, different qualities, and that it does make sense to accord differential moral consideration based on those degrees of sentience. So, you know, one of the classic, you know, philosophical problems, you know, if you run to a burning building and you can only save either a human or a chicken, right? I'm saving the human every time. And while that's partly an emotionally driven decision, you know, technically that is also because I do accord a higher moral consideration to the human, because I think it has a richer range of sentient experiences than the chicken does. So I think most sentientists would agree with my view that there are different degrees, and it allows you to take that sort of decision. But not all do. Some do stick with a more, you know, strict equality.
So at that level, it wouldn't be categorized as speciesist, right? Because you're judging it based on which creature is more likely to suffer, or something like that.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. So, you know, I would say that sentientism is not speciesist, because it doesn't use species to determine moral consideration. It uses sentience. But some in the animal advocacy movement would still criticize my version of sentientism, because they would say, yes, but you are still differentiating between species, because different species have different levels of sentience. So, you know, you're still being speciesist to some degree. And I'd say, well, you know, fair enough, but it still feels morally justifiable to that. The other thing I'd say is that sentientism does still draw a baseline. It still does say, even for a, you know, an animal that has even a very basic level of sentience, we still need to give it some meaningful level of moral consideration, such that we'd see, you know, needlessly harming or killing it as a moral negative. So it does draw quite a strong baseline, but it does allow that flexibility, Quavena, that you were talking about before.
Cool, thank you.
Cool. Well, let me go on to the next view, which, you know, links to the previous one, but I'm not a big fan of isms generally, but I think they can be useful terms, and so there's some hesitation about introducing yet another one. But this might be a useful way of clarifying some of these distinctions between sentientism and some of the other isms that are out there. We've talked about some of them already. And let me go round them in a anti-clockwise manner. So there are different ways of deciding what types of things to care about morally, and you can work down the scale if you like. You can think about humanism focused on all humans, you can think about sentientism focused on all sentient beings, but there's also eco or biocentrism. So in biocentrism, this is a moral concern for everything that's living, not just sentient things. So for example, a biocentrist might have direct moral consideration for plants or for the bacteria we were talking about earlier on. Ideally, they'd also have moral consideration for all sentience, because all sentients are living things as well, but they would go even further than that. And an ecocentrist goes another step beyond, in that they look at moral consideration for even things that aren't alive that are in the environment. So, you know, rivers, mountains, ecosystems, and so on and so forth. So the distinction here is, I think, worth touching on, in that most sentientists are deeply committed environmentalists, because they see how important the wider environment is, you know, the air we breathe and the plants in our environment and the rocks and rivers. They see how critically important they are for the experiences of sentient beings, right? So the reason, as a sentientist, I care about climate change is not because I care about the climate, it's because I care about what it does to animals and humans, right? That's the moral wrong that climate change will cause that makes it a problem. It's not, you know, air pollution in itself doesn't hurt the air doesn't suffer. Whereas a biocentrist or an ecocentrist goes beyond that and actually has more direct moral consideration for those things as well. You could argue that those people are also sentientists because they do have a base moral consideration for all sentient things as well. But what you'll often find is that people will jump to a rich level of environmental concern, but sort of skip and forget a lot of the sentient non-human animals that are actually capable of suffering. So you'll see some people who are, keener to offer rights to rivers or mountains than they are to offer rights to farmed animals, as an example. As you move around, Sentiocentrism is very similar to Sentientism in that it just says we have moral consideration for all sentient beings, but Sentiocentrism isn't explicitly naturalistic. So if you had a religious mindset or a supernatural worldview, but cared about all sentient, you'd be a Sentiocentrist, which is an even more clunky term. But if you're essentially secular or naturalistic in your worldview, then you'd be a Sentientist, if that makes sense. And we talked about the difference between anti-speciesism and sentientism there before, and I think we've described that well. There is that distinction of degrees of sentience, which might seem like it's speciesist, but it is using a different and I think a morally justifiable characteristic to make those distinctions instead of species, which is arguably more arbitrary. There's some interesting movements that again relate to sentientism. There's one that some of you might have heard of called effective altruism, which Peter Singer has been closely involved in and helped found, which is this idea not just that we should have moral consideration for all humans and all sentients, but we should also do the most possible good we can to help them. So there's a lot of overlap between the philosophy of sentientism and the movement of effective altruism. But again, effective altruism isn't explicitly naturalistic, whereas sentientism is. Transhumanism is another interesting movement that some of you may have heard of, which in a sense is it's taking an unashamed look at biological and other forms of technologies to enhance and extend the human experience. So extending human lifespan, enhancing human experiences. And some people in that movement are also sentientists, but many of them are very focused on humans and what humans will become, and again have sort of skipped the fact that there are billions and trillions of sentient animals out there as well. We've also anticipated that link between vegetarianism and veganism, in that there is a strong link, because if you're a sentientist and you have moral consideration for everything that's sentient, that by implication means you want to try and avoid harming or killing them. And of course, animal farming does exactly that. And the vast majority of animals that we farm are sentient. Right? We don't really farm many of the, the very, very, very simple animals that wouldn't count as sentient. So there is a strong overlap between sentientism and veganism.
Sorry.
But again, so Painism was actually developed by Richard Ryder, who's one of the guys who came up with sentientism in the first place, because he was nervous that in some readings of sentientism, you could take a lot of pleasures that were created for different entities and use them to justify causing suffering to somebody else. So he developed Painism as a more, as a subset, if you like, of sentientism that just focused on reducing suffering. Animalism is very close to sentientism, but the difference is that sentientism is at least open-minded about, other forms of non-biological sentience. But animalism is also completely naturalistic as well. And then we come back to the differentiation with humanism at the top. And I think this is important because I want to make acknowledge that, I'm a member of Humanists UK and have been for many, many years. I still count myself as a humanist as well as a sentientist. And humanism, at least the international HEU and Humanists UK, have already added a concern for other sentient animals to their definition of what humanism is. So when you talk to, Andrew Copton or you talk to Alice Roberts, they will be very clear that the word human in humanism isn't just about what do we care about, it's just about the moral subject. So it's saying, look, humans as moral subjects have an obligation to all other humans and arguably other sentient life as well. They say the word human in humanism doesn't restrict us from caring about other sentience as well. So that's a positive step that you could argue has taken humanism quite close to sentientism already. I guess the difficulties are, and we can have more of a debate around this, is that one, the name is still very anthropocentric, and that flows through in practical terms, one, to most humanists, because I'd argue that most humanists aren't even aware that that concern for other sentient animals is in the definition, and most humanists certainly don't apply that to their daily lives and their daily decisions. And when you look at the campaigns that humanist organizations run, they are almost 100% about humans. And while you can acknowledge that that's a sensible campaign priority, and they can't do everything, and there are other organizations out there doing other things, it does lead you to the conclusion that the vast majority of the humanist movement is almost exclusively focused on the human species, and there's not much space or scope around that. And that's partly really why I'm very keen to talk about sentientism, at the very least for it to act as a sort of healthy pressure movement on humanism or within humanism to try and extend it. And for many humanists, this is a very natural move. I think, I was at the Darwin Day lecture a couple of years ago, given by Dr. Diana Fleischman. I don't know if some of you made that. But I asked a slightly cheeky question towards the end of the lecture, and there was an audience of maybe 1,000 humanists there. And I just asked how many of them were ethical vegans or vegetarians, and about 40% of the people put their hands up. And that is much, much, much higher than the general level in the population. So I think there's already a substantial overlap between humanism and sentientism. And many humanists, because they are careful ethical thinkers, they're compassionate people, and they're willing to follow evidence and reason, essentially many of them are already where I am. So I'm just hopeful that I'll encourage more people to shift that way too. So hopefully that gives some contrast between a bunch of the different isms, and why, of course, being biased, I think sentientism takes the best of all of them and the worst of none. So and thanks for the questions that are coming up as well. Let me answer those as we go, as we move on to the next picture. So there's a question there about oh blimey, sorry, I've missed loads. Yeah, let me take these and then we'll come back. So there was a question earlier on about is sentientism a position of moral being universal? And yeah, in a way, I know many people are hesitant about taking a universal approach to things, because it can feel like one group of people have defined something and are trying to push it on everybody else. And that way of thinking clearly has some pretty bad history. But actually, when you're careful about what you're being universal about, I think it's fine, right? If the only things we're being universalist about are a commitment to evidence and reason, and a decision that we'll care about all suffering, regardless of the being that's able to suffer, I think those are sensible things to have a universal agreement on. And then we can disagree on almost everything else after that. But they seem like two sensibly basic foundational things where actually, I am an unashamed universalist, if that makes sense. But I'm sure we'll come back to that in a bit. There's a question about, does the reason for the pain matter? I'm not sure. I think it does, because what sentientism isn't necessarily interested in the stimulus of the pain itself. It's interested in the actual nature of the experience and how that feels positively or negatively to the being concerned, right? So there are certain types of pain which you might experience as something very negative, and there are certain other types of pain which you might actually have, as with childbirth, there's a positive side to that as well. So I think I'm not talking about sort of technical pain scale here. I'm talking about sentience as being the full richness of possible experience. So in that sense, yes, it would matter. The next point is really good, which is, sentientism would say there's a presumption to avoid creating pain, or you could say killing. But as with human ethics, this could be overridden. Absolutely right. This isn't saying there are no circumstances in which it's acceptable to cause pain or death. As with as you say, with human ethics, with a substantial justification, it can be the morally right thing to do to even kill a human or harm a human. So it follows that line exactly. It doesn't say it's always wrong. It just says causing harm or death is a moral negative. So to justify it, you need you've got to have a really strong justification that offsets that. And there's all sorts of debate and argument about how to justify and how to, make those decisions and those moral trade-offs. There's a question about organ donation. Could we still use animal organs to extend human life? And again, Sentientism is neutral on that, and this might irritate people because it doesn't pretend to be a perfect answer to every moral dilemma and every trolley problem. All it says is you have to have moral consideration for the sentient things involved. So if you counted, non-human animals as 0 on your moral scale, you would have completely unconstrained animal testing and use of animal organs. You'd see them as an instrumental thing to use in whatever way you liked, purely for human benefit. And a sentientist would say, no, we have to accord them moral consideration. That doesn't mean you couldn't justify using them in some ways, in the same ways you could justify harming a human, if it really caused substantial, unavoidable benefit, in other ways. But so it changes the calculus, if you like, of your moral decisions, but it doesn't necessarily give you an answer.
So I think Peter Singer, doesn't he use the example of testing? When it comes to testing, I think he says, well, if you'd be willing to do the testing, say, on a chimpanzee, if you'd be willing to do that testing on a impaired human being, say someone who's got a very low IQ, Down syndrome, someone who's got brain damage, if under those circumstances you'd be willing to test on a human, the good is overriding, you'd be willing to test on a human, then he says, well, maybe you'd be willing to test on a chimpanzee. So he's kind of setting up, and well, most people would agree, no, we wouldn't test on a Down syndrome or a brain damaged human being. So he uses that to kind of canvass an argument against animal testing in general, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's an interesting example of how sentientist thinking might lead you through it. But you might come to a different consideration. Again, if your degrees of sentience and your degrees of moral consideration weight in different ways, you might come to slightly different conclusions. And there aren't easy answers to many of these trade-offs, both within human and animal ethics. But what it does say is that, but I think if you do have a base level of moral consideration for everything sentient, you tend to come up with different solutions in the first place. So quite often the reason we're doing animal testing in a particular space isn't because it's the only way of doing it. And in fact, there's lots of research coming through at the moment showing that a lot of animal testing is actually not entirely useful when you transfer across to humans. And there are model-based ways that don't cause suffering where you can do alternative types of research. So certain types of harm might well still be justified, but you tend to find less harmful alternatives when you actually show proper compassion for all of the sentient beings involved. Another interesting field is that of wild animal suffering. So if you look at population control of wild deer or those types of issues, and these are really complex moral, ecological issues. But if you don't really take account of the moral value of each of the sentient beings involved, humans tend to jump quite quickly to killing stuff. so whatever the problem is, it's like, I know, let's go out and shoot it, or let's go and poison it, or whereas actually when you take a more nuanced view, you might come to that conclusion, or you might find that actually we can use contraceptive darts, or we can use some other creative approach that causes less harm. I'm not saying this gives you perfect answers, but it does make it more likely you'll find a less harmful answer to some of those really difficult problems. There's another good question there about physical pain. I mean, physical pain is certainly part of the sentient experience, and it's a critically important one. But it does also include mental pain as well. So, sentience isn't just about physical pain or physical pleasure. It's also about a full range of experiences. And there are some types of sentient beings that might not be able to experience some of those things, right? So I think it is likely there's certain types of pleasure and suffering that are unique to humans, right? Is a dog really capable of existential angst? But I don't know. Some of them maybe are. But yes, it's the full range of those experiences. And interestingly, there's no reason why the current human range of sentient experience is the limit. People already experiment with adjustments to their own biology that change their sentient experience in very rich ways. And with future technologies, I'm sure we may well be able to broaden that even further. Okay. So yeah, good question from David. From a sentientist point of view, it's the suffering and the flourishing of the animal that counts. It's not actually seen as that relevant whether we see the animal itself as a moral agent. We're interested in its experience and the suffering it goes through, and whether it's a moral agent or not doesn't really differ, or doesn't really reduce that suffering. Some schools of thought would differ, and they would say that we should accord higher moral consideration to something that's capable of being a moral agent. But Sentientism, the view is all suffering matters, regardless of whether you see that entity as being a moral agent. And you can get in some really interesting philosophy around, does free will even really exist? If not, maybe even humans aren't properly moral agents. But maybe that actually leads you to a better formulation of justice than our current retributive model. So, that's a bit of a tangent, but I quite like that line of thinking itself, in that it's almost dangerous to think too much about whether humans or animals are moral agents, because it leads you to a retributive punishment mindset in your justice model, rather than thinking, how do we mitigate future harm? And if you only think about mitigating future harm, your justice model tends to be focused on deterrence and protection and rehabilitation, and not punishing some moral agent that could have decided to do otherwise. So I think the negation of free will actually leads you to a better justice model. But
sorry, I was just going to add, but Tom Regan, who's kind of a father of the animal rights movement, uses the terminology of moral patient to describe the state that animals are in. It would also apply to vulnerable humans who are, low functioning. So he'd say what's relevant is, does it have a kind of does welfare apply as a concept to, say, an animal or a disabled child, not whether it can actually decide right from wrong?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good distinction, right? So sentientism is interested in, are these things moral patients? Can moral harm be done to them? And the answer is, if they're capable of experiencing suffering, then yes. So we should care about them morally. So that's that moral patient concept that you said laid out there, as opposed to the moral agent concept. I agree. Well, let me move on a little bit, but I'll come back to these questions. It's really good to have them pop up as we go through. So I'd suggest, we've already covered some of these best arguments against sentientism already, which is good. And I won't drain them here. But in a way, you could say that the arguments against sentientism are all of the arguments against atheism and humanism. So there's arguments about religious revelation and the supernatural, and the universe must have had a designer, and the Bible or the Quran says it, so it must be true. So there's all of that stuff. There are concerns then about where are we drawing the boundary of our moral circle. So it's saying, look, no, humans are the only things that should matter. We shouldn't care about animals. Or some people will go the other extreme and say, well, plants are sentient too, or we should give rights to rivers and so on. So people will argue about where that boundary is. And then some people will argue about the technical aspects of it. So they'll say sentience is too vague. We want a nice clean binary decision for our moral basis. Is this too vague to use? And I'd argue, no, it's not. Life and health are also quite vague dimensions, if you like. But they're still, many of the most useful concepts still have fuzzy boundaries, and much of science has funny boundaries because we're always trying to get, slowly get less wrong. So I won't go through all of these, but these are quite useful reading, and I do try and paint the strongest possible arguments against sentientism, just to test the baseline we're trying to set up here. Let me just flip back. So so far, this might seem quite sort of philosophical and esoteric. So I think it's quite interesting to, just as a thought experiment, say, well, if you imagine a situation where most of the 8 billion people on the planet said, okay, fine, sign me up. You know, I'm a sentientist. I'm now committed to evidence and reason informing all my beliefs, and I am committed to granting moral consideration to all sentient beings, right? What changes? What changes in terms of personal decisions? What changes in terms of corporate policies and NGOs? What changes in terms of laws and regulations and policies? And you know, I've written some articles that sit behind this, but this is really just a pick list of some of the stuff I think would just disappear if most of the world was sentientist. And I think you can group them in different ways. One is sentientism itself is a form of discrimination, right? Because we're saying we're discriminating between whether something's sentient or whether it isn't. But we're saying that's a morally justified discrimination, because if something can't suffer, it doesn't need moral consideration. Whereas if something can suffer, by definition, it can experience good or bad, therefore it's a moral patient. So in a way, we're saying that sentientism is the only morally valid form of discrimination, but all of these other forms should disappear, right? So if someone is genuinely sentientist, none of those, you know, they should not apply any of those other types of discrimination in their mind. You can also see there's groups of harms that are justified by supernatural or traditional practices, right? And again, humanists are very familiar with many of these lists, and quite often, you know, we might forget about some of these forms of harm in sitting comfortably in London or wherever we are. But you know, certainly when you look globally, these things impact, you know, many millions of people's lives on a daily basis. So those types of harms, where when you look at, okay, the harm is clear, the harm or the death caused is clear, but the justification is purely supernatural. When you remove that supernatural, that traditional justification, and you just look at that practice on the basis of flourishing, suffering, good and bad, the motivation to, you know, carry out those practices disappears. We've touched on it already, but in simple terms, you know, if you genuinely are a sentientist and you grant moral consideration to all sentient beings, I'm not sure how you can participate in animal farming. And that is a very uncomfortable thing to hear for most humanists, because you know, eating meat and dairy and, you know, it's just such a normal thing to do, right? It's so embedded in the social fabric of most of our lives that it's quite hard to follow a moral path to decide to give that up. But you know, I do think it is an implication, and I'm sympathetic to how hard that journey is, because it took me bloody ages. And for most of my life, I was aware of this ethical line of thought, but I just deliberately avoided thinking about it because I didn't like the implication. Because, you know, socially and habitually, it's just a hard thing to give up. But and I'd also point out that, you know, even getting to the point where someone's gone vegetarian or vegan isn't some sort of perfect, pure moral state either. You know, almost every decision we take, almost every piece of consumption we do causes some form of harm, right? There's no perfect, pure state. It's just about a motivation to try and reduce suffering and death. I think there'd be implications in policy and government as well. So some forms of government, I think, you know, would just disappear, right? Clearly, theocracy doesn't exist in a sentientist world. But I'd also argue that some of the harsher autocratic forms of government, you know, fascism, you know, the negative forms of nationalism and so on, you wouldn't see those come through, because you can't justify those based on a morally compassionate consideration for all sentient humans, right? So you have to have some form of government and policy setting that is framed around universal compassion and trying to help everybody. Now, there's so much disagreement about the best ways of doing that, right? There are sentientists all across the political spectrum. There are anarchists and socialists and social democrats and, you know, the full swathe, right? But there are certain types of political structures in government that I think are excluded based on a sentientist, compassionate worldview. And based on the evidence and reason side, again, you'd say the same thing about a humanist government. You'd see much more evidence-based policy. You'd see much more rigorous experimentation, building evidence, taking different points of view, and driving policy forward. You know, not just on focus groups and you know, PR responses, but actually based on a genuine scientific understanding of likely outcomes, existential risks, risk management, contingencies. Basically just good policy. So, and again, I'm not going to drag you through all of these things, but hopefully it gives you a sense of how, one, in common with humanism, that commitment to evidence and reason has radical implications across every sphere of our life, and humanist organizations are involved in campaigns in many of these different things. But then when you layer on that extension of the moral circle to include, in essence, the vast majority of animals, that layers on a different wave of implications of changes we might see in the world if this type of thinking gets picked up. Let me just do a quick check of the other questions that have come through. Yeah, transhumanism in the context of lockdown of the virus. I think you're right, because one of the there can be some ways of thinking within humanist and even environmental movements that are very nervous about new technologies and different ways of driving progress forward. And I think some of those are entirely justified. But at the same time, it's quite useful to take a scientific approach to those, and rather than resisting technological innovation because of tradition, to also make sure we stick to the facts and are open to the benefits they can bring. And I think we will see more of that. Some of the transhumanists go too far the other way, right? They're so overexcited about the possibilities of technology, sometimes they forget about the ethics, and so there's a balancing act in there as well. David, the idea of a declaration of animal rights is interesting because it prefigures the picture that's coming up in a couple of minutes. I've tried to rewrite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a universal declaration of sentient rights, so we'll get to that. Plants, plants is a really interesting point. So again, sentientism is neutral on whether plants are sentient. It says, if they are, we'd have to give them moral consideration. But the latest scientific consensus is that plants have very rich communication. They respond to the environment in fascinating ways, but they don't have the information processing capability required to generate sentient experience. So it's entirely possible to have a very rich pattern of behaviors and communication, but not actually be sentient. So again, the science will shift, but that's my understanding of where science is at the moment. That plants, pretty strong view that they're not sentient. So justification for death and pain, there are plenty of sort of theoretical trolley problems, but you can see real situations as well where causing harm to one individual might save the lives of another 1,000 people. There are many different theoretical and real examples where there's a justification for causing harm or even death. Ethical animal farming would be an oxymoron. I think if it involves harming or killing the animal, then yes. And it's quite hard to farm animals without doing either of those things. so that's the difficulty. There are better and worse, right? So there are types of farming, very small scale farming, where you could argue the animals live reasonably, happy long lives, and then then are killed. That killing is still harmful and a moral negative, not just for the animal, but for the family around it. So even the best forms of animal farming, I still don't support, but they are worlds better than, sadly, I think in the US it's over 99%, but worldwide it's about 90% or more of meat and dairy is actually factory farmed. And the conditions in those circumstances are deeply, deeply horrific. I won't go into it because it's awful, but that is the default, right? So many people will say, oh, I use locally sourced meat, and I only buy free range from so and so. Unfortunately, 70% of people say they do that, but 95% of the food comes from factory farms. So there's unfortunately some form of disconnect there. Where are we? Are we living in a transhuman reality? I think that's a really important point, right? There's oh, sorry, is that a private? That's a private message, so maybe I shouldn't read that one out. unless you meant that to be an open point of conversation. But I think I won't read the question, but there's an interesting point that transhumanism isn't just about some crazy future sci-fi world, right? Arguably, we've been living in a transhumanist world as we use different technologies already. This thing, in a sense, is a absolutely mind-blowing enhancement to traditional human capacities, as is this house I'm living in. So, I think that's a fair point, that transhumanism is a graded thing we're all living through. It's not some weird sci-fi thing in the future. Getting rid of Trump, yes. Yeah, I don't think anyone would call Trump a sentientist. I don't think he has a strong commitment to evidence or reason or universal compassion. So, I'm very comfortable he doesn't tie up with the the philosophy. But, oh yeah, sorry, thanks, David. So yeah, so your question was, aren't we living in a transhuman reality already? We live in a world of big and metadata, where there's this huge spectrum of pain and suffering. The point is, no living thing pursues the need to suffer. It's important to understand human history, and the history of life is about going beyond the risk of suffering. I agree, right? And there's some fascinating philosophers. One of my favorites is a chap called David Pearce, who's written a book called The Hedonic Imperative. And he's essentially saying the end point for not just human civilization, but sentient life should be perpetual states of hedonic bliss. So what he means is essentially a heaven in real life on earth, because we've got rid of all suffering and we've enhanced the experience of our brains through technology and drugs and through the reality of the world around us, to the point where we are already always in a state of wonderful hedonic bliss. And that doesn't mean we're just pressing the button to get some sort of basic drug stimulus. It means actually a fully rich, sentient, wonderful experience. And it may seem a little otherworldly, but why not? Why not? So really, there's a good point there about animals harming and eating each other in the wild, because, and while I do that, I'll just flick onto another view that might be interesting to peruse of sentientist changes we could make. So this is an interesting challenge to many in the animal advocacy movement as well, in that many people in the animal advocacy movement are understandably totally focused on animal farming, because humans farm, it's about 75 billion land animals every year. So those are forcibly bred and constrained and killed every year, and there are trillions of fish on top of that, right? So that's a harm that humans are causing at a massively industrial scale now, and so understandably that's where animal advocates want to focus. But many animal advocates also have this sort of weirdly supernatural affinity with nature and the environment. That means they're very nervous about the concept of interfering in nature. Whereas from a sentientist point of view, and again, other sentientists would disagree with me, all suffering is bad, right? So even in the wild, where an animal is preyed on, that animal doesn't care about the fact it's a wild animal, not an animal, not a farmed animal. It's still suffering, right? So you might see a lot of the David Attenborough programs in a sense are almost like snuff movies to me, because the animals being preyed on genuinely are suffering. So that opens up a very immature field of work around wild animal suffering. Is Trump sentient? I've just seen that. Where people are now starting to do some serious work about wild animal suffering, and is there a potential eventually for us to even intervene in the wild and reduce wild animal suffering? It's obviously a much harder thing to do than resolving animal farming, because with animal farming we just need to stop and transition to plants and help the farmers shift to growing plants instead. Wild animal suffering is a much tougher problem, but it's not intractable, right? So you can imagine ways that we might actually come to intervene in wild animal suffering to even reduce that. And you link the interesting point we discussed earlier on about animals as moral agents. You'd say, well, how can you criticize the lion for killing the antelope, right? That's in its nature. That what else could it do? It has no other choice. And in a way, that's a fair point. But the antelope is still suffering. It is still a moral negative. I'm not suggesting it should be as high a priority as ending animal farming, but we shouldn't ignore the suffering that goes on in the wild, because it's probably at a similar, even larger scale than what we do through animal farming. So it's a fascinating space. I do think Trump is probably sentient, but not a sentientist, and that's difficult as well, right? Because some of these topics, religion and humanism and animal ethics, are deeply important and very emotional, and they can generate a lot of aggression and trauma because these are such important topics. But that's a really important thing to remember, that even the people we disagree with are sentient as well, and they deserve our compassion. And when you see humanists being aggressive or snarky or negative about religious people, or you see animal advocates saying things like humans are the virus, we should massively depopulate humans to leave a wonderful green planet, I think those people have lost their ethical moorings. You need to remember that even the people you disagree with are sentient too. Right, a couple of other questions here. Trump is a sentient being, yes. So presumably animals cannot be sentientists. I think that's probably fair at this point, because we have the capacity to not just hold moral beliefs, but also to examine our own moral beliefs. Now, you could argue that maybe some of the more advanced animals, chimps and so on, have a degree of introspection that isn't that far away from us. But with some other animals, they probably just don't have the capability to examine their own ethics in that way. So you can adjust for the capabilities they have based on what's possible for them. I agree. But that doesn't mean that you excuse the suffering they cause, right? It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and find ways of mitigating that suffering. Okay, theory that pleasure needs unpleasure. Heaven on earth is not possible. So I'm not too familiar with the Freud perspective, but there is a general response, which is, are we using a narrow definition of, or a simplistic vision of happiness or pleasure here that negates the sort of richer sense of something being worthwhile or meaningful, and that's not what Sentientism is saying. It's not just saying we want some sort of simple life free from physical pain where we feel pleasure. It's acknowledging that a really important part of the sentient experience, particularly for humans with the capabilities we have, includes those richer senses of things being worthwhile or meaningful, and that includes challenging and working through suffering and addressing problems. So I think that's another way where some types of suffering absolutely are justified, right? You train to get stronger, or you take some personal risk to save somebody else, and all of those richer human experiences are also part of what the moral calculus is counting up in sentience, if that makes sense. It's not some sort of narrow pleasure and pain remit. Okay. I'm not familiar with ethylism. White Splainer, are you able to come up? Do you want to come off mute and just tell us what it is?
Okay, so are you familiar with antinatalism?
Yes.
So ethylism is derived from life backwards, and it's an
yes, of course, yeah,
of antinatalism to the natural world. If we eradicate all humanity, which would be, well, essentially the goal of antinatalism, we're still left with the barbarity of the natural world. So an ethylist would hope that all of nature extinguishes itself also.
Thank you. No, it does. It rings a bell now. I have heard of it, and I'm familiar with antinatalism as well. And I think it will be interesting, because I think for most humanists that will come across as quite a shocking stance to take. But it is actually an implication that many come to from a sentientist perspective. It's not one that I subscribe to, and I don't think most sentientists do either. But in simple terms, and again, you can put me right, but the line of thinking is that existence for sentient beings is generally more suffering than it is flourishing, and on that basis, over time, the universe would be a better place if nothing sentient existed at all, because at least we'd be back to zero rather than having a universe that is predominated by suffering. So it really comes down to a judgment as to whether you think sentient existence is more positive or more negative, and if it's more negative, should that lead you to an ethylist or an antinatalist stance where you think it would be better for it not to exist at all?
So yeah, David Pearce thinks that we can use technology to re-engineer nature, not just humans, but also nature. And he thinks if we actually die out humans, there's going to be no one to kind of curate and improve nature in various ways. So that's why he goes for the transhumanism. I'm just a bit more skeptical whether, I think the technology to actually improve humans and improve the natural world is more complex than the simple decision on behalf of humans to, you know, stop breeding and also to introduce some form of contraception into nature and just eradicate it.
Yeah,
very pessimistic view, but it is grounded in, you know, the same concerns as sentientism, negative utilitarianism, basically avoiding suffering. The best way to avoid suffering is just for there to not be any existence.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an interesting stance, and I think you've laid out the case for it there. I mean, the reason personally why I don't subscribe to it, and I think most other sentientists do, is partly because we have a sense that on average, no one feels the average, but on average, sentient existence is more flourishing than suffering. And you can debate whether that's, you know, accurate or not, but certainly for humans, it feels that way despite all of the awful things that go on in the world. I guess a point of evidence would be that most humans, and in fact most animals, you know, individually do want to keep living. Now, my understanding of the ethicist or the antinatalist stance is to say, well, yes, you've evolved to want to keep living, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're right to want to keep living, because the rest of your life is
optimism bias.
Yeah, it's an optimism bias, right? So even though, you know, most sentient things, you know, want to keep living, you know, you would say that that's an optimism bias and still isn't the morally right thing to do. And the second reason I don't hold that stance is very similar to David Pearce. It's interestingly, he's in some of our sentientism groups and has added himself to our war. Is that the future potential argument is that, okay, things, you know, there is awful suffering for many sentients today, humans and non-humans, but, you know, we do actually have the potential within, you know, a reasonable period of time to fix all that stuff. And again, you can have, you know, long, complex debates about our chances of doing that. But no, that's a fascinating, an interesting stance that I think will be probably new and maybe quite shocking to quite a few other people on the call. So thank you for explaining it to us.
That's a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it's just in response to Daniel. I can't remember the name of the philosophy was talking about.
David Pearce. David Pearce, I think.
Yeah, but I think it's I don't know how you define, you know, when life is worth it, you know, regardless of the struggle of wildlife or even humanity's struggle, regardless of, you know, when things are really bad, you have moments when you see the animals enjoying themselves and the little children, you know, the young animals enjoying, and those moments until the end should not be underestimated. I think it's still worth it. And in terms of, I'll talk about my dad in his last days. It got to a point that it was in so much pain. And if I had the means to inject him with something so that the pain would stop and it would go, I would have done it. Before I used to just, you know, if it's too much pain, life is not worth it. But when I went through that experience with my dad, and in the midst of the pain, he used to enjoy this documentary, Science of the Stupid. So he would look forward to it every evening and he would laugh his head off. And I thought, yes, this is what his life means. He did not want to die until the very end. And he had those little moments. And for him, it's worth it. So I'm always worried about, you know, and things are going, some of the environmentalists and, you know, those who care for animals and everything, it's going towards human hatred. You cannot care for animals or wildlife and not care for human beings, as as horrible as we may get sometimes, and as much pain we're inflicting on other beings, you still don't hate human beings for that.
Mm.
Yeah, I think we'd need a whole different forum to discuss antinatalism on this front. So
Yeah.
probably worth returning to Sentientism proper.
Yeah, no, sounds good. And my only final point is that actually the antinatalist stance isn't people being necessarily negative about humans and saying, you know, we should wipe out humans because they're destroying the planet. Some people do say that, but the antinatalist stance is actually one of compassion for humans, because it's, and again, I don't hold this view, right, but they're saying that because human suffering is so bad, it would actually be better for humans. So in a way, it's compassionate. But I disagree with that stance. But.
And there's a distinction just quickly between killing humans, obviously, that goes against principles of consent, and desiring that they were never brought into existence. That's a fundamental claim with antinatalism. If you can avoid causing pain, you're morally obliged to do that. So when you create a human life, you create a life full of suffering. You're not morally duty bound to create pleasant experiences, so the pleasant experiences don't outweigh the unpleasant ones. That's the fundamental antinatalist asymmetry. But as I said, it would take hours and hours to fully go through those arguments.
Yeah, no, fascinating. Thank you. So there's another good set of questions here about different cultures and pushing opinions onto them. And I think if you're going to take a stance which has universal compassion, that includes a consideration that people want their own autonomy and they want to take their own decisions and have their own beliefs and follow those beliefs. So that's an important part of their sentient experience that you'd want to respect. I think a sentientist government wouldn't ban religion, for example, but it would have freedom of religion. But where those religious beliefs, for example, or cultural beliefs were used to justify causing harm to somebody else or to some other sentient being, then I think society would step in and put those constraints in place. And one of the other things that sentientism is, I think, taking a stance on, and as I said, it's in a way it's unashamedly universalist in that context, is that some moral thinkers are so sensitive to cultural or religious modes of thought and traditions around the world that they then end up condoning, or at least not condemning, some really awful human rights abuses. So there are, even quite prominent thinkers who put themselves forward as moral leaders who will refuse to condemn sexism, homophobia, racism in certain cultures or traditions because they're so nervous about being sensitive to those traditions. And some sentientists would disagree, but a generic sentientist stance says, look, we want to respect freedom for everybody to believe whatever they want to believe, but we will be willing to apply, legal and other forms of constraint to prevent harm and killing to other sentient beings. So it takes a stronger line on, protecting from harm, and does not listen to supernatural justifications as as a valid reason for causing those types of harm. Does that make sense? So it is unashamedly universal, but at quite a basic level. So, and that does include acknowledging the value of freedom for everybody. So, but that freedom, as in any modern humanist culture, should be restricted. From being used to cause harm elsewhere. So let me just flick through a couple of other ideas here. Again, I'm not going to take you through in enormous pain, but we talked about some of the practical changes that a sentientist mindset would have. You can also look at things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think many of you will be aware of, a sort of globally UN agreed set of goals for trying to make the world a better place. But again, as with most of these really important documents and aspects of human progress, it's all about making things better for humans, and that's great and important, but it doesn't go far enough. So as you look through the different sustainable development goals and you examine them, you can actually think about, if we did broaden out our scope of moral compassion to all sentients, what would that mean for those sustainable development goals? How would they change? And if we embedded a commitment to evidence and reason into how we progress all of these sustainable development goals, would we actually get there quicker, and would we be more effective? And one of the interesting things you find is that some people will say, look, we've got enough problems to deal with in humanity itself. There are so many inequities and problems and so much suffering being caused to humans already. Surely that should be the priority. Why get distracted by thinking about non-human animals and other types of sentience? But the interesting thing is, when you broaden your moral circle, just as we found as we've done that within humanity, it benefits your own group too, right? So when you look particularly at something like animal farming, it's pretty topical, but 77% of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 come from animal farming and hunting, not just wet markets, but from all animal farming. Like I said, bird flu, BSE, swine flu came from animal farming, not just from bats and pangolins. Animal farming drives a massive problem around antimicrobial resistance. And it's one of the biggest causes of climate change in terms of land use and water use and emissions. So interestingly, it's less of a trade-off. It becomes a win-win, where you broaden your moral circle to encompass sentient animals, and it's actually the best solution for humans too. And you'll see those types of examples, if you have a chance to flick through some of this stuff later on. It would actually simplify the SDGs and actually accelerate many of them. Again, I'm biased because I think this is the answer to all of our problems. And we talked about this earlier on as well. What does it mean for rights? So again, humanism, I think, can claim the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a crowning achievement. To think about how quickly, as a human race, we moved from a sort of feudal, completely fragmented, warring society to a position where most of the nations on the planet could agree a single document that granted universal rights to all humans. Learning the lessons from the two world wars, it's phenomenal progress, and we've got obviously so many more problems to deal with and so much further to go. But it was a major milestone. So this is just an interesting thought experiment of what if we rewrote that document to grant rights to anything sentient, and you end up with some interesting challenges in doing that. But actually, it felt like most of this worked for me, right? And I've actually written the full document out in the link if anyone's interested in looking it through, because quite a few of the rights just play across naturally. We humans and non-human animals all want to live. We all want to avoid harm. We all need food and water and sustenance and shelter. Obviously, when you get into some of the higher capabilities and higher rights, those don't apply across all sentients. There's certain things that it only makes sense to grant those rights to humans, but generally for a lot of the more basic stuff, at least as a thought experiment, you could apply those more broadly too. And it's, again, maybe it's early, but you can also start thinking about how you might build the needs of sentient AI into some of these frameworks as well. So again, it's just an interesting thought experiment. But as David said, do we need a universal declaration of sentient rights, not just human rights, to move away from that anthropocentric view? And I will come back to the questions again. So there is no sentientist organization, right? There's nothing really to join or to leave. There's no rules. It's just a worldview, a bit like humanism is, right? You either agree with it or you don't. But we are trying to build a bit of a movement around it. So there are a bunch of different online fora you can see here. We finally got around to building a somewhat amateurish website where people are adding themselves to a wall with some personal messages. So we're trying to get more conversations going around it and get more people involved. Partly to spread the idea, because I think if we can get to the point where a higher proportion of the human population are committed to evidence, reason and compassion, we'll end up with a better world in all sorts of ways. But most people then go on to campaign in different areas. So people will join Humanists UK and work on humanist campaigns, or they'll work with some of the animal advocacy charities, or they'll, so there are many, many different organizations out there who are already working on important campaigns that align with the Sentientist worldview. And I think there's already quite a latent pool of people who think this way out there. So if you look at, you know, just as a proxy for a commitment to evidence and reason, these numbers are all a bit messy, but it's approximately 10% of the world's population are atheists, from what I could work out, which might be 770 million. If you take being vegetarian or an ethical vegan as a sort of proxy for a concern for sentient animals, it's actually a similar sort of number. And assuming there's no correlation between those two, that's already, you know, a few tens of millions of people who might think along these lines: evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentience. And as I say, there's already anecdotally a much stronger correlation. So it does seem that atheists and humanists are much more likely to be vegetarian or vegan than the average. And the same the other way around. Actually, it's even stronger correlation. The proportion of vegans that are atheists is, again, much, much higher than in the general population. So it does seem there's a sort of overlap in the diagram here of people who are willing to commit to evidence and reason and then think very carefully about, you know, where their moral circle gets drawn. And that's the wall. So on the website, there's a wall that you can click on the link. And people, if all of this dry philosophical stuff is too boring, it's quite an interesting counterpoint, because you can go and just read some personal messages from people about, you know, why they're a sentientist and why they agree with the idea. And most of these are just random, you know, interested lay people like me from all over the world. We've got Brazil and Uganda and France, and, you know, the list goes on. But there's also some interesting notables in there as well. So we've got Kamagasha, who runs the Freedom Centre Uganda, in there. We've got David Pearce, who's the philosopher that our friend White Splainer mentioned earlier on, and we've got Peter Singer, who actually helped frame the term in the first place. And George Church, whose name you might know if you're science fans, because, you know, he's generally touted as the father of synthetic biology. So we've got quite a nice mix, both here and in some of these online fora, of, you know, very serious academics and activists and writers and policy people, but mostly just interested lay people who go, yeah, makes sense. You know, I like that philosophy, and you know, and I'd like to identify with it. And so far in these groups, it's, you know, it's been nice to have that mix of, you know, deep academics and some VIPs and, you know, randoms like me as well.
I think Amajit wanted to say something. Amajit, can we unmute you? Yeah.
Yeah, I was, hang on. I was afraid that I might take too long. I want to give Jamie, you know, and others time to actually, you know, finish his talk, and then for other people to ask all the questions they wanted to ask. Yeah. Have other people got some more questions?
Go ahead, Amarajit. There's some more there as well, but you go ahead, and then I'll read the other questions that have come through.
Yeah, some of my comments going to be quite controversial, so I would ask people not to sort of jump to the conclusion, you know, and give me the time to sort of say my bit. Yeah. Now, you mentioned Jeremy Bentham. You know, he's the originator of this concept of sentimentalism, if you like. Yeah. But you know, all these arguments have, I say all, not all of them, but most of these arguments have been gone over in ancient India, and they're still alive in modern India. They are not abstract philosophical arguments. They are real life arguments where you actually have to make a decision on what to do because you're in the middle of it. You know, the concept of, you know, every living being is subject to pain, and therefore they deserve the compassion, is actually central core of Buddhism. You know, it says some people suffer less, some people suffer more, but we all suffer. That's a sort of starting point, and therefore we need to be compassionate. And the whole thing came, as I said earlier on, because the Aryans were basically burning down what was a massive forest in the Ganges Valley. You see, they were setting fire to it. They were killing all the indigenous people. They were killing all the animals. I'm not talking about 1000 BC to around about 800, 700 BC. And that's where the three great religions in India came from. Buddhism, Jainism, and there was wasn't so much a religion. They were called Ajivkas, and they said nothing can be done about it. This is fate, you know, because their whole world had changed. You know, they were hunter-gatherers, herding people. Some of them are living quite in harmony with nature, and that way of life was never going to come back. So this is the historical thing, you know, where it sort of started from. Now you talk about moral circle. to me, morality is always changing. There's nothing fixed about morality. If we were to go back, 2.5, 3,000 years in the past, slavery was quite moralistic.
Yeah.
It was justified. The philosophers justified it. Actually, they went further than that. Philosophers in India, religious people said, well, you are born in a low caste or untouchable because of the heinous deeds that you must have committed in your previous life. The law of karma, you see. And it was very, very difficult to fight against this concept. And these people that I mentioned, Buddhists, Jains, and Ajivkas, they were obsessed with getting liberation from this so-called karma, and they couldn't do that. And that's become the sort of central thing, in about Indian philosophy, was how to get liberation. Now, what are the morals? Morals change all the time, Some years ago, even in the 1950s and 60s, I've seen it myself, the way women used to get treated, in the office. I'm not saying it's improved that much. There have been some improvement, but the morals and ethics at the time were pretty horrible. And the morals and ethics many white people had were pretty horrible. They used to call you all sorts of names right to your face. And I do believe that they believed that that was quite okay to do that, Now, the point I'm trying to make is that morals are changing all the time. So where do we hang on to? What do we hang on to? What we say is the better moral. And to me, if you're going to have morals, you better base it on selfishness. Well, that sounds very contradictory, right? So if we're going to have some morals about the globe, the whole world as an ecosystem, we got to learn to take care of it. That's selfishness on our part. It should be driven from selfishness. Yeah, my sort of what I call definition of selfishness is quite strange in that sense.
It's an enlightened selfishness.
Yes, it should be driven by selfishness, because we are dependent on the planet, we're dependent on these animals, we're dependent on lots of things. And even some of the viruses out there, you don't know what they might hold for mankind, in the sense of, if you could learn about the viruses, you could learn about how these affect human beings. Yeah. Even they have a place in the whole of the ecosystem. I mean, my wife said the other day, is Mother Nature fighting back, this coronavirus? And to an extent, that is quite a simplistic way of imagining, the whole thing. Now we talk about morals. There's some religions who say, for example, Jains, they will wear a mask on their face because they don't want to breathe in, germs. That some of them, go to that extreme, because they don't want to harm any living being. Yeah. Now, the flip side of that is, I know for a fact that there were Jain generals in Indian history. Yeah. Women Jain generals who fought. They have this particular title, So how did they square this up? They could square it up. They could say, well, when we are attacked, when somebody causes us suffering, then it's okay to fight back, sort of thing. These are just comments I'm throwing around, for people to think about. You can be quite hypocritical, like in Tibetan Buddhism. You can say, well, what they used to do was, if they wanted to carry out a death sentence, they would throw somebody from a 6-story window, because it was the Mother Earth that did the final deed that killed the prisoner. So that's quite kind of hypocritical. But people like me, it is a practical, if you like, moral dilemma you have to actually struggle with, to wrestle with all the time.
Amajit, can I ask you to ask a question, or?
I'm just taking comments so that, these are sort of provocative comments so that people can ask, more questions.
Okay.
How do we, for example, Hindu Upper people say we are non-violent, we are vegetarian, we are vegans. Some of them are vegans, right? Okay. And yet they lynch people if they think that they are having something in their, which is, sort of beef, cow. Or if you're transporting a cow somewhere, they will lynch you, right? Now, I had an interesting argument, in the 1990s with people on the internet who said Muslims in India should not carry out any sacrifices. Yeah. And I thought very seriously about this. And I said, okay, why do you say that? Because it's cruel. I said, well, your ancestry used to carry it out. It was cruel then. The morals have changed. But it isn't a question of religion, moral, ethic. It's a political question. Yeah. Because there was an anti-Muslim wave. This Islamophobia and kind of also anti-women thing as well. Yeah,
I agree. And I think
what I'm saying is we have to be very, very careful, right? Because in real life, the contradictions can be so extreme.
Amarajit, what I say, because I want to make sure we leave a few minutes, because I know we're running out of time in case there are some other questions as well. But I agree. I think there's a really interesting observations, and the two things I'd say is, one, I think you're right that in a sense, morality has evolved for selfish reasons, because even before humans existed, cooperation evolved in non-human animals, right? I mean, that's partly why humans have ever had a moral basis, is because it works to help keep us alive, right? Because we work well together. Now, humans have then evolved a set of capabilities that have enabled us to examine and apply reason to our evolved morality, so that we can extend it and develop it even faster without necessarily having to wait for evolution to force us to collaborate. We can do even better. And what I would argue is that morality will always continue to shift, but if it's based on a scientific grounding of evidence and reason, you can progress much faster and from a solid basis. And most of the issues you've talked about involve people who are ethical in one sphere arbitrarily deciding that some other group of people don't count. And if you're committed to moral compassion for all sentients, and you're committed to only discriminating based on evidence and reason, essentially you can't do those things. So that's partly why I'm suggesting that sentientism, in one sense, might be the final moral step in setting a baseline that's scientific and has broad compassion. But then, as you say, the moral debate about details and trade-offs and priorities and complex resolutions and rights that clash against each other will continue forever. So are there other people that had a question they wanted to drop in before we run out of time?
I didn't want to take too long.
And I'm very happy to continue the conversation by email or on Twitter, or I love talking about this stuff. So if you run out of time, just reach out to me. So the contact details are in the presentation. Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah. Hiya.
Sorry, Jamie, could you press on with the, and finish the presentation so we can then have a question stage. If other people want to stay on longer, they can stay on as long as they like, but just so that if people wanted to leave, then they could do so knowing that, okay, we've finished the presentation. Is that okay, Jamie?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm basically done. So so the final slide there was just the wall you can go and have a look at, and then there's some extra reading links. But if Audrey and Clive are okay, we can send this out to everybody who joined today, and you can read it in your own time. But yeah, that's the whole thing. And apologies for taking so long. But I can stick around.
That's fine.
I can stick around for more questions as long as you like, so.
Thank you so much, Jamie. We really, really appreciate it. And I think the time has gone so quickly, and it's because it's been so interesting. And I think we may want to have you again, because we need more time on it. Thank you so much. Before everyone leaves, I just want to introduce you to our next meetup, which is next Saturday. I can see a link somewhere between today's discussion and next week. Next week is about the women of Umoja in Kenya, who they had to flee to set up their own village for safety, and that village is only for women. There are many aspects to that village. It's about living on this, sharing this planet with men, and the challenges of that. So I'm hoping that you all please attend next week's meetup, and we discuss these issues together. Also, Association of Black Humanists, we need your support. Any amount that you can give us, we'll be happy. We are running it, Clive, myself, and Audrey. Most of the time, we are running it from our personal pocket because we are passionate in being humanists. We are passionate, we are concerned about the impact of religion in Black society, Black countries, Black community. And we are doing all that we can to spread, basically we are not attacking religion, but to spread a way of life tied to reasoning, to evidence-based science, to have more appreciation for science. So any amount that you can give us, if you can pledge monthly, that will be fine. Also, we'll send an email with our bank details. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. We really appreciate it. And we hope that one day we will not have the need to have Association of Black Humanists, because Black people too, they will live mainly a rational existence. Thank you so much.
Just say that our bank details are in the chat, so please take those down. You can use them now or use them later. As you say, any donation is mostly is gratefully received.
Okay, I believe there's a mechanism for putting your hand up if you want to ask a question or you want to talk. So I can't see it on my screen, but Audrey, can you see it on yours? Does it show up?
Yeah, it's in the reactions. But if people are leaving, that's fine. Now would be a good chance, a good opportunity. If you to sort of, we have said that we'll finish at 6 o'clock, but Jamie's very kindly said that he will stick around. So if people are willing to stick around, maybe not for too much longer, but you know what I mean, just in case there are any last minute things. If people want to do that, if they can let us know, or if we'll stick around for maybe 10 minutes or something more, just to have those last minute sort of mop up questions. Yeah,
sounds good.
Okay, so again, does anybody have any questions? Please, I'll unmute you. If you can't unmute yourself, I'll unmute you, and then you can ask your question. Does anybody want to ask Jamie a question or make a statement even?
I think Nana,
David, go ahead.
Yeah, was listening to Jamie's excellent lecture or seminar. Just a thing, I mean, are you sure that we should really put morality around the idea of depending on a scientific or sort of other intellectual basis? So for instance, I mean, from, like I said, I take it from the experience of the COVID lockdown, everyone expected the collapse of the infrastructure in this society to kind of disrupt the social cohesion in society, but in actual fact, our need to come together has actually it surprised me actually, because it just, I mean, despite the fact that we never really used Skype or any other communications technology to try to maintain our networks. In actual fact, it's actually together despite the collapse of the technological infrastructure and the social infrastructures that have been disrupted by lockdown. Do you think it's a little bit of a mistake to try to put morality with the necessity of having any kind of philosophical or technological input? Because obviously, from what we've observed, I mean, the morality has continued to go on despite these unfortunate collapses that has gone on.
I think there
How
can
do you
be
respond to that?
Yeah, there can be a nervousness that by linking, this commitment to evidence and reason, or you might say it's a broadly scientific approach to morality, that it implies we're just sort of putting everything in a spreadsheet and working out what's good and what's bad, and that's not the intent. I think there's a few ways that the scientific worldview or the evidence and reason plays in. One is, as Amrajit said, understanding the sort of evolutionary genesis of our morality, where our baseline morality came from, and the fact that even animals before humans existed had some rudimentary form of morality. So it's useful to use evidence and reason to understand where our baseline morality came from. And then it's really just about being as explicit as we can about what causes harm, what causes suffering, and taking better decisions. It doesn't mean we can ever be perfect, and it doesn't mean we should just sort of coldly put things in a spreadsheet to decide. I think that's a fair caution, that we shouldn't cut out the emotion and the softer stuff here as well. We need a richer appreciation of what it's like to be human, what it's like to be a sentient being. And generally, I remain a real optimist about what we can do. I think most people are good people. Some of them have bad ideas, right? But most people at heart care about their families, care about people around them, and to the degree they're comfortable, are willing to care much more broadly than that. And I think you're right, we've seen that in this crisis. So I think that's a fair point of caution, and I don't want this to sound like it's a coldly scientific approach to morality. It shouldn't crush out the sort of soft and natural emotional responses to these things as well.
I think it's a good comment. I think it's a good comment because, it raises the question, like the anthropologists say, what is it that makes us human? That is the big question in anthropology. And the answer is, what makes us human is what happened in Africa a very, very long time ago, when our ancestors of all mankind, learned to actually cooperate, to communicate, to be dependent on each other. And they were also concerned, about their environment. I mean, when you killed an animal, you actually offered it apologies. Because you were not supposed to kill things around you, but you considered it necessary to feed yourself and your family and your clan. We made progress, by doing that. But of course, the flip side of that was that, as we made progress, as we shared resources within the clan, but we also sort of fought against other clans for territory and resources. And that's been the story of mankind. There's two aspects to it. There's the good aspect and there's the bad aspects. And I think both of these aspects are still with us today in this COVID-19, pandemic, because the good aspect is people are actually getting together. People are trying to support each other. That is very good. That's part and parcel of our, us being human. But
and I think that's
the other aspect, which is people are trying to make money out of it.
Yeah, and I think that's another important counter, right? Because while it's nice to acknowledge the sort of softer emotional side of how we feel about morality and so on, that can lead us to some dark places, right? We've already talked earlier on about how a sort of traditional way of doing what feels right can lead you to a situation that does awful harm to other groups of people, right? So while we don't want to negate the emotional, richer side of the feelings of what's moral, it's useful to have that evidence and reason check just to make sure that you're not causing harm that doesn't need to be caused, right? So I think that balance is there.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that if we, don't look at the sort of class issue in all this, the power issue, the money issue,
Of course,
who's got the power, then we could go wrong in this, We have to take all these things into consideration, and I think I'm sorry, I forgot there was somebody who mentioned this West trying to tell us what to do, and there is some element of truth in that. I think this philosophy is grounded in Western culture.
Well, so I disagree.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, and it came up on the chat a couple of times from Nana. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Is this just about another sort of Western philosophy being imposed on the world from sort of high horse? But my counter to that, right, is that I think all of the elements of this philosophy predate the Western Enlightenment, right? So we've already talked earlier on about Jain philosophies or Hindu philosophies or Buddhist philosophies going back thousands of years that already had a much broader moral circle than the human race. And we're all very aware that humanism wasn't invented in the Enlightenment either, right? I mean, anyone who's familiar with the UK humanist campaign points out that there have been secular and scientific lines of thought going back into Arab cultures and Chinese cultures. And so yes, fine. I put my hands up, right? I'm a European, right?
No, I wasn't trying to
talking here. No, I know. Right? But all of the themes of this philosophy predate Western Enlightenment, and none of them came out of Europe. So we might be repackaging them, bringing them together, and we've got to be careful how we put these things forward. But I'm hoping that they
That's what I'm saying.
I'm hoping they can genuinely have universal appeal, but I'm not sure.
Nana, did you want to come forward as you put that point forward?
Yeah.
Nana, did you want to answer?
Sorry, you hear me? Hello.
Yes, go ahead, Nana.
Hey, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. Now, Jamie, appreciate everything that you've said, and I understand where you're coming from. But I have to say, I'm probably going to pronounce your name wrong. I'm Amajit. You've got a very valid point you've made numerous of times. Jamie, you are repackaging what most cultures already done. So I'm afraid this will come across another case of Christianity being reinvented into Africa. Many cultures will see it like this.
Yeah, I think there are some elements of this philosophy that you can see coming through Christianity. The golden rule and caring for other people, for example. Although most of Christianity is very specifically about humans, and the messages about how you treat animals are very mixed and normally quite negative. But I think all of those elements predate Christianity, right? The golden rule wasn't invented in Christianity. The golden rule predates Christianity. So I think that's a fair point that there are themes in religious, supernatural, and secular philosophies that are being repackaged here. I mean, none of this is really new, except in the way it's been brought together. But I don't think it can be viably seen as a repackaging of any specific religious philosophy or moral system.
Ultimately, if the ethical theory works, does it really matter where it comes from? That seems to be the genetic fallacy. So, this is just a branding issue.
No. Actually, there is a valid truth to this. If you look at the history of it, in terms of European using elements of many things to actually go into other cultures, there is importance to actually know and understand where this is coming from. Yeah. You cannot dismiss this fact. You'd be naive to say this is not the case. If you look at in the case of Islam, the same identical issue we had before. I'm not speaking for Africa. I'm not speaking for India. I'm currently in the Caribbean, Central America, and I can see the same similarity that's occurring here. So it doesn't matter where it's coming from. Many cultures already do have this these belief systems already. But whereas you're repackaging and renaming this thing, it almost feels identical to Christianity, where it was introduced, it was pushed into other cultures.
That's an interesting point of view, because I think there's some stark differences between Sentientism and Christianity. So one is...
sorry, Jamie, I'm not making any comparison to Christianity.
Oh,
What
okay.
I'm saying is that the way that it was introduced to other cultures, it was merely repackaged. It was a Middle Eastern religion that was repackaged by the Europeans and reintroduced to Caribbean, to the South Americas, and to Africa and the other colonies of Britain and Europe. My point is, it's very much similar route that you're going into. I mean,
can I just say, isn't this more a case of repackaging it, but not for Africans and not for India, because they've already had this, but repackaging it for European market? I think that's the kind of thing of if we can see those links from India, from all of those places that aren't in European culture. If that element was put through more, it's repackaging it not for Africa, not to be put back to those other cultures, but to be actually, it's not part of European culture. And that's the idea that maybe, that, you know what I mean, might be more in forward. And it's so repackaging, I mean, you're making a comparison with Christianity, and I think what you're doing is the mechanism, but we're talking about a very specific thing, and the Amaji has already it's been around for a long time. So what we're saying is, but it hasn't been a part of European culture for a very long in this way. And I think that's the kind of repackaging that we're kind of thinking about, as opposed to putting it back to Africa or putting it back to India, because it's already there. And I think there'll be some pushback for that. So I think
there is this thing that I'm really worried about. If an European is saying something about certain universal values, we assume that they are selling it to us. And we need to know that in Africa and everywhere, you know, whatever journey humanity is taking, or, you know, moral journey that we are taking to have universal ideas, they are not selling it to us, they are just bringing up, I don't know how to explain myself. For example, some people would say, oh, homosexuality is not African, it's the West bringing it to us. Whereas that is not the truth, which it's okay when Europeans say certain things. It's okay for things. It's just universal human values. It can be expressed by Europeans, it can be expressed by Africans. Let's come, you know, let's join in this conversation and be part of it. This is human issues. This is planetary issues.
Yeah, well, the point I was trying to make was, I agree with you, Lola, that these are universal issues, and if humanism and even sentimentalism is going to be universal, then it has to address all the problems of all the peoples on this planet. You see?
Absolutely.
Because it is so very easy for people to justify certain things. I gave some examples, you know, from India and from Tibet and from elsewhere, right? You can justify anything, you know, in philosophical terms, you know, on paper, in discussion and argument. There are lots and lots of things that you can justify. I mean, for example, in Iran, one of the things was they were carrying out experiments on pigs, you know, for organ transfer. And it wasn't a question, they weren't asking the question, is the pig a sentient being? You know, they were asking the question, is this Islamic to do this experiment? You see? Yeah. And the mullah said that it was quite Islamic, yeah? But the point I'm trying to make is that there's some very, very clever people out there. You know, a lot of the Hindu Upper people, for example, are justifying mistreating almost in fascistic measures in India, you know, using these very similar kind of arguments.
But you know that
I'm going to ask us to wind up now. We've got 15 minutes.
I'll just say one thing.
If we can just kind of bring our last sentiments in,
I'll do just one last thing. The fact that there are certain practices in different societies, you know, that can be harmful to human beings and other earthlings, it doesn't mean that even in those societies there are people that disagree with it, you know. So sometimes we just assume that this is what goes on in this society, and that's what everybody likes. The people don't, you know, all the universal idea about not causing harm, reducing pain, it's universal. And sometimes it's just that those voices sometimes are oppressed. And I think, you know, what I'm learning from Jamie today is that let's bring it back to us, human society, and let's work towards this together.
I'm going to end it there. I think, Jamie, you have set some hornets out there. This has been an amazing, amazing
Yes.
meet up. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who stayed on, the hangers on there, who hung in for the last 5 minutes. I am going to say that we're going to end it for now. So, you know, Jamie, if you send your stuff to us and we can get it out to everybody who was here today, and we may have to get you back. I'm sorry, you can't just wander off. You can't leave us hanging like this. We are going to have to get you back and continue the conversation, because there's a lot that needs to be unpacked. We might kind of tease out some of the elements that we're talking about. I think, sorry, I'm going to say it. Nanaja, you raised an interesting point, and I think Nanajao, apologies, we raised an interesting point, and I think it's a perspective that needs to be at least brought into the argument, because if we're going to have this conversation, we do need to have these conversations, because we are also coming from a point, especially as Black people, from a place of harm and from a place of trauma. And those issues still need to be looked at. And when new ideas come in, I think sometimes, you know, people who've been through trauma, we then, you know, we are looking at it from a slightly different perspective. So I think, you know what I mean? Thanks for all of those conversations. Thanks for all of this. I'm going to bring it to a close, and I'm going to say thank you to everyone. We will do this again, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Virtual hugs,
Yeah.
virtual
Thank you,
hugs
Audrey.
to
Bye.
everybody.
Brilliant questions. Thank you.
Amajid.
Great stuff.
Okay, brilliant. All right, take care, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.
Just press
Bye.
the leave, and we'll see you. Bye, Christopher. Bye-bye. I'm not sure who else is here, but goodbye, and we'll see you all again. Look out for our next meetup. We will be having